Welcome back or welcome to the Time Crunch Cyclist podcast. I'm your host, Coach Adam Pulford. Here is a rhetorical question for everyone listening. And it is that epic race that we're all training for seemingly more epic each year? It's either that or I'm getting older, and that's definitely the case. But man, after watching my athletes race at Unbound this year, and the advent of Unbound XL, seeing courses with bigger stages like Cape Epic, or even the recent BWR in North Carolina that I participated in, just seems like these events are leveling up their epicness. And this isn't a bad thing per se, but it definitely makes you want to have all your ducks in a row come race day. When you're crunched on time, it's hard to arrive perfectly prepared for everything that comes your way on, races and events like this. So I thought it'd be good to talk to another coach about some of our recent silly adventures down south and share some tips for anybody swinging big for their summer events this year so that you can be as prepared as possible. So my guest today is CTS coach Maddison Russell. Maddison, welcome to the show.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Adam. Awesome to be here. And stoked to talk about just the craziness of where these events are going these days, because I know you and me both experienced it in a very profound and acute way just a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, profound and acute are two great adjectives for an event like that.
Right.
And yeah, I mean, for anybody here, watching on YouTube, or if Maddison's voice sounds a little familiar, you've probably seen Maddison on some of our other content at CTS and whatnot. But Maddison, can you just do a quick intro on who you are and what you do?
Yeah. So I full-time coach with CTS. I've been with CTS for about, it's been 6 years at this point. Time's definitely flown by, but it's been awesome. I've been an endurance athlete for a long time. So that's been my whole life, whether it's coaching, competing. It's been about, I think, 17 years, 18 years at this point between running and cycling. Full-time cyclist now. So, I've competed in road, gravel, pretty much everything at this point, and work with people, all around the world across all disciplines. So really seen kind of a wide range of people, of events, of competitions, and just really soaking up the whole world of endurance sports is kind of my whole MO. So it's been an exciting journey so far, and excited to continue that.
Awesome, man. Yeah. This BWR that, I alluded to us doing about 2 weeks ago, not your first rodeo, but I remember talking with you at the finish line, and you were like sitting down like in the grass and mud all over your face. And I was like hobbling over to go get like a Coke, and I couldn't even like bend over because my back hurt so bad. But like, I mean, like, was that thing harder than you thought, or was it just me?
Yeah, 100%. And I think like that's going in, you look at it, you're like, this looks really hard on paper. Going in, I was like, okay, like I'm going to have to obviously prepare really well and, dial everything in. Like, it ended up being, harder than I could have imagined. Right. And going in, and, I've done other BWR events too, right? Like done the San Diego race, did it just a couple of months ago. And they always put in wild and crazy stuff, right? And it's always dynamic. It's always, you're on and off, grass switchbacks, and then gravel, and then road. But this event, I mean, it's got to be definitely the granddaddy of BWR events. And, I think like as far as toughest events in the country, the announcer kept saying it over and over again, right? You probably heard him as well. It's definitely got to be up there, right? Yeah, definitely a lot tougher than I was expecting. Just looking at it on paper, it doesn't show you where that difficulty is coming from. You see 13,000 feet, you're like, okay, this is gonna be really hard, but you don't see that that's coming from, a 30% hike a bike, for 5-10 minutes, right? You don't know where that's coming from. You're not sure exactly what you're getting to until you take that turn and you look up the road and there's a wall in front of you, right? And I think that's kind of what everyone in that event experienced, was just curveball after curveball of really challenging situations and terrain.
Yes, yes, exactly. And this isn't, I don't know, this is not an advertisement for BWR. We don't have any affiliations with them. I mean, I like those. I like everybody involved. I think they put on a really good show. A lot of my athletes do them and they enjoy them. But for anybody who doesn't know what Belgian Waffle Ride is, a bunch of events throughout the country, and this one in particular, North Carolina, like you said, on paper, 131 miles, 13,000 feet of climbing. In reality, it felt like 1,000 miles, and
Right.
15,000 feet of climbing,
Yeah.
and it was, I don't know the exact split, but a lot of off road stuff, and they call themselves, the Unroad event. So again, we knew it'd be hard. I thought it was a lot harder because of those curveballs, and those curveballs as well was like proper rowdy single track that I would have had a blast on in my full suspension mountain bike.
Yeah.
But we're dragging ourselves through there on, 40C gravel bikes and stuff like that. So, I mean,
Right.
this is the kind of event that we're talking about right now.
Yeah. Yeah. The wild and crazy, right?
Yeah. Yeah. But like I said, I think that is actually good, because people want to be challenged, and there was like nothing death defying or something like that. So the main premise again for this episode is, for all of us out there, as the mystique is building, and somebody's friend talks them into going doing this, or they hear us and like, oh, that sounds awesome. It's like, let's talk about how to, like, with a good healthy dose of reality, help prepare people for this thing, right?
Right, exactly. Because it's there's nothing worse than not being prepared, for that
Yeah.
challenge, right? And that's not just preparation in terms of, going out there and riding your bike, right? There's multiple layers to that, right? There's
Yep.
nutrition, there's hydration, there's skills, there's course planning and recon, and making sure that you have the plan going in, right? And you've done that plan in training many times before, and I think
Yep.
it's, you need that preparation, and you need to check every box, right? Not just go out there and do the monster rides.
Yeah, for sure. So I'd say we'll get into the meat and potatoes here, but this, I'd say this episode, this goes for time crunched athletes. This goes for the weekend warriors. This goes for the time rich athletes too. I mean, this is all stuff that everybody needs to hear if you're doing big epic events. So, I'd say, like, if we can boil it down into uh, a few bullet points, my first one would be for everybody is to get as fit as possible if you're doing something that's over 100 miles with thousands and thousands and thousands of feet of climbing. And that may sound obvious to everybody. It's like, oh, yeah, fitness, right? Make sure that's high.
Yeah.
But so many of my athletes, and I hear a lot of people, they're stressing out about tires, about wheels, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I hope that they go just as deep on the internet about training as they do on tires or something silly like
Yeah.
that. I mean, am
Right.
I crazy in thinking that that should be the first obvious point?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it's so easy to get sucked down the rabbit hole now, because especially there's so much material out there to digest as far as
Yeah.
tire choice and what are the pros running, right? That's, you get that question all the time.
Right.
What's so and so running? What's this guy running? Should I do this? Should I do that? It's like, that first step is like having the really rock solid foundation to your fitness, right? And then you
Yep.
kind of, you add, those are like cherry on top type things, right? The like
Right.
extra little layer at the end, and of course you want to test those things in training too, but put most of your energy, most of your eggs in the, like, hey, let's just make sure my preparation, the physiological side, you know, is where it needs to be, focus on the demands of this event. Cause ultimately, like, the bike is under you, but you're the one putting the effort in, right? Like,
Yeah.
your body is the thing that has to be optimized the most, right? Otherwise, it's not going to really matter what tire you choose.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And so, that's kind of the philosophical bullet point. I'd say the reality or the real bullet point is, how do people get fit? And my
Mhm.
question to you is, like, what should our listeners focus on in their fitness program as they're prepping for something like this? And that's kind of a can of worms, and you can say it depends on all
Right.
these things, but I'd
Mhm.
say, just from a generality, like, what kind of energy system should they be targeted or focused on? And how would you structure some of that?
Yeah, for sure. No, that's it. Then that's a great question. I think like first, you want to look at the demands of that event, and say, okay, well, what exactly am I working with here? What is this going to take from me? What are the zones or the intensities that I'm going to be riding in the most over the course of this 7, 8, et cetera, how many hours it is, right? And for most people, that's going to be, a lot of time at threshold, a lot of time in sort of a zone 3 tempo. We use sweet spot, right? A lot of people refer to sweet spot, and it's going to be a lot of zone 2 and below as well. So I think when you look at how to structure training for some of these really long endurance events, you want to have a blend of that endurance to zone 3 tempo, but also a lot of that threshold work. I think threshold work has to take precedent over most types of work going into something like this, because that's really going to inform what you're capable of doing for those longer durations as well, and how well you recover from, the 10-minute effort, the 20-minute effort that you'll need to do, the beginning, up the climb, the middle of the course, things like that, right? So it's, early, as you're, prepping for the season, really making sure that you're laying that foundation, laying the groundwork to handle the higher intensity down the road. And then as you get closer, really making sure that you put that emphasis on time at sweet spot, time at threshold, right? And as you get into that sort of critical 8-week window, you make it as specific as you can, right? That's where you're really doing some of those really long rides, some of the bigger, harder threshold type workouts, and building the time and intensity out is kind of the goal. There's throughout the season, like the emphasis on time and intensity should increase as you get closer to that goal.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I do think that threshold work, which is using or utilizing the glycolytic energy system, that that's really what I would double down on for anybody training for these events. And what Maddison and I are talking about are efforts that feel like a 7 or 8 out of 10, usually hill climbing in anywhere between, 10, 20, even 30 minutes if you got the real estate for it. But doing a lot of time in zone, repeated efforts like that, that's the structured work that's really going to move the needle for preparing you best for something like this.
Yeah.
And so, Maddison, you kind of talked, we didn't really talk about, like, super hard intensity, high intensity
Yeah.
VO2.
Right.
I don't know. Would you incorporate that at all into a training program, or?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and that's something that I think a lot of athletes that are training for some of these really long endurance gravel mixed surface events kind of get hung up on, is like, do I need to do that high intensity? And I think a lot of them just ignore it. But I think every type of intensity, every type of training, no matter what you're training for, has a time and place, right? And I think
Yeah.
it's determining the time and place for that work based on the ultimate goal that is the thought process you should go for, right? And so yes, I think incorporating, high intensity, if we're looking at it like VO2 work, right? Maximal intensity VO2 work, right? I think a lot of people like, I'm not training for a crit, or I'm not training for a road race. Like, do I need to do this? And I think it comes from like partly the idea is like you shouldn't really have to do or want to do some of those efforts in a race like that, right? Because that may mean you're going too hard, right? Or doing an effort that's unsustainable for an event like that. But VO2 max also plays a really important role in how well developed your threshold can be, right? And so I think if you ignore that work, you're going to spend a lot of time hitting threshold, but ultimately you may just be bumping up against that ceiling that's not high enough, right? There's not enough room. There's nowhere for you to go after a certain point. And so I think a healthy dose of VO2 work here and there throughout the year is really key for everybody, and it goes down fast, right? You lose it quickly, right? And if that is too low for too long, I think your gains in other areas get limited. So I would work in VO2 work, and a good place to do that would maybe be a little bit farther away from the event, right? So maybe not in those last 8 weeks where you really want to get very narrow and specific, highlight the intensities you're going to be doing the most of in the race itself, but somewhere in that sort of preparation foundation phase, working in a block of VO2 work can be really critical to make sure that you're going to take advantage of the threshold work down the road.
Yep. Very much so agree with that. And I've had various guests on other episodes where we talk about some of this ultra sort of planning or ultra distance or ultra endurance, working that intensity a little bit further out to get all the gains that Maddison's talking about there. So I think that's a very sound and logical way of, preparing a race specific training program for that. And one other kind of like little nugget that listeners can take away with is, we talk about race specificity for something like this. And usually, like in all the books and stuff like this, as we come into a race time period, people are talking about like speed intervals, on off, VO2 and all this kind of stuff. I actually use something that I kind of just call fatigue resistance training, but what it is it's taken like about the race intensity that you'll use for almost the whole day or long periods of time, and doing that out in training. So it's doing like 4-hour days with a normalized power that's probably in people's tempo or maybe like low threshold, and really just like drilling. It's like steady hard all day.
Yeah.
And it's very fatiguing. And so you don't want to do this the week before, but we're talking 4 weeks before, because it is very specific. And say your threshold is, 300 watts or something like this, that normal, so that your tempo would probably be more like 260 or something like that. So normalized power, maybe a little lower, 240. So the normalized power for 3-4 hour ride around that 240, the perceived effort is just a 6 or 7 all day. And I use that sort of workout to prepare well for these events. I don't know if you do the same thing, but
I love that. I think that's something that I do with people as well. And I think that can be accomplished in a number of ways. It's like building out, high volume. Maybe you're doing 3 hours, 3.5 hours, but 2 of those or 2.5 of those are all sweet spot, right? And you're just 30 minutes or 40 minutes at a time, and, short rest, do it again. I think it's because ultimately, especially in the first half of these races, you're putting in a ton of time in that zone, right? That sort of zone 3 sweet spot. Your normalized powers, I know me personally, a lot of my athletes as well, that's kind of where it comes out to. And I think so building the fatigue resistance to that type of intensity is really key. And you look at any number of these guys that are, very competitive within these events, they're putting in a ton of time in that range, just to train all the time, and it's because that's where you're spending a lot of time of the race, right? You're matching what you're doing in training, and in some cases, the training ride probably feel a lot harder than the race, and it should, right? And I think that's the other piece to work out like that, Adam, and a big benefit of it is just the mental confidence side, right? Like you have an athlete go out and do that, and they're like, oh, I can put in 3 hours, at this range, right? Or 4 hours at this range. I know what it feels like. I know how to fuel during it, right? And they carry that confidence going in for sure.
Yeah. It's huge. And because it checks all those boxes with the process of training, fueling, hydrating, that kind of thing. And for some of our listeners, that may be confusing, especially if you are always like reading and listening to things that are saying, polarized training is the way to go, or, you can't do 2 hours at tempo or something like that. Actually, you
Right.
can. And Polarize is a great modality and a great method of training, but to get the specificity and the durability needed for some of these events, you got to go medium hard for a long time, and
Yeah.
that's what I found to be very
Yeah.
successful. Yep.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's like the real world practicality half to it,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because
Yep.
at the end of the day, like you can do as much zone two that you want, but if you ignore an intensity that you're going to spend potentially, 30 to 50% of your race at, then I think you're doing a disservice to being truly prepared for it, right?
Yeah.
And I think though again, I always go back to time and a place, right? Like absolutely, we need
Totally.
that polarized model in that zone two time, but I think it also in you put that time it informs on being able to do those zone three sweet spot type efforts, right? And it,
Yep.
it can help you with that, but that's really key, right? Because I just love that practicality side where it's like, what are you actually going to be doing most of the time, or for much of the time that you're racing your bike, right?
Yep. 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 Agreed. So, just for listeners out there, just like in summary, a workout like that, you can try just starting with like 60 minutes or 90 minutes, somewhere in there, of a normalized power of like low tempo, and just try to, and it can be swiggly. It doesn't have to be like, on the trainer, super steady, right? In fact, I would encourage
Probably
you.
won't be perfect, right?
No, it won't
It's
be
hard to
perfect.
get perfect, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So I tell my athletes like rolling hills, some flat, add in a couple hill climbs,
Mhm.
pedal a little bit on the downhills, because all that happens like in the race, right? Because you're like
Yeah.
trying to catch somebody as you're going down. So like it's just a mix of everything in order to kind of get that normalized power over a longer period of time,
Mhm.
specific to what you'll likely be racing. So try that for 60 to 90 minutes at first. It's a little fatiguing too, so just be wary of that, and then you can build out 2-3 hours at a time. But it's a cool workout to try, so try it.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
my next bullet point, Madison, is also seems like pretty simple, but I want to tell everybody to make sure that they show up as fresh as possible on race day.
Right. Yeah.
Am I
Yeah.
right in that thinking?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just talking to an athlete the other day, and we're talking about, resting and tapering. And,
Yeah.
she was telling a story about, her husband, and he had the taper tantrums, right? Where he was like sort of second guessing, like, I need to do this last key workout, right? Or I need to do this like big, key workout before this event, right? And I think
Yeah.
it's easy to second guess that, but I'd trade a little bit of extra freshness, or a lot, for a little bit more flatness every time, right?
Yeah.
I think in a lot of people that have been doing it a while, I think they'd feel the same way, because your experience, trusting your fitness, those things are going to show through on race day, right? And like
Yeah.
feeling a little flat, you're going to forget about that when you're, an hour in, and you're trying to hold the wheel, right? So if you're sort of in that, like, do I need this extra super hard session at the end? I'd lean toward just more of a recovery day, at that point.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, fully agree. And the rule of thumb that I use is once we're 7 to 10 days out, there's not much more than we can do other than get more fatigued. So that's when I start
Yeah.
shutting things down, at least for a 1 day event. And I take down volume quite a bit.
Mhm.
I don't know, maybe 50%, something like that. I keep some intensity in there. I like a little snap if everything's going well. But yeah, if taper tantrums, is that what you used?
Yeah,
That's a
yeah,
cool,
yeah,
that's a cool
yeah.
term.
I actually, I pulled that. I know, Coop makes that. Our coach Jason Coopy, I think he mentions that in his book, and I kind of pulled that from out there, and I was like, oh, that's a fun. I love that term,
It's an
because
awesome term.
yeah, it's just, and I was the same way leading into the event a couple weeks ago. Even as a coach with the experience, I'm like, wow, I feel terrible. Like, what's going on? Like, is this going to come around? Like, lo and behold, the day of the race felt great, right? And
Yeah,
it's easy, no matter what your level of experience is, to sort of second guess where you're at that point.
for sure. And I think to that end, I mean, taper tantrum, what we're really talking about is just like, anxiety. You want to go, you want to move, because that's a good sign, actually, because you think about everything that you were doing. You're just doing a bunch of training. You're very busy. And then all of a sudden you don't have that because you've reduced volume by 50%. You only have,
Yeah.
you got some intensity, but it's not enough to blow off the steam like you once did. So you
Mhm.
have these emotions that come with a taper, and that the taper tantrum is what we're talking about. But intellectually, I would remind yourself, like, if you're feeling that, cool, thumbs up. That means you're probably doing it right. If you're blowing out,
Yeah.
or if you're like, oh God, that's probably not a good sign. So take an extra rest day.
Yeah.
Um, I'd say for me, myself, leading it, there's a lot of things that went unexpectedly, and it just,
Yeah.
including like, am I getting sick and all the things. And
Yeah.
my taper was basically 5 days off the bike leading into BWR. I'm like, I'm going to be stale as heck. But
Yeah.
to your point, it's like, I've been through enough of this stuff. I'm like, yeah, I'll take the staleness if that means that I'm going to be closer to 100% for sure.
For sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that, like, I tell people is like, if you're in that situation, just always go back to leaning on your experience, right? If you put in the
Yeah.
training and you put in the time, it's like, trust in that experience. Don't be afraid of your fitness, right?
Yeah.
You've got it. The hay is in the barn, right? Like,
Yep.
we've all heard that term, like, and like you said, it's like last couple weeks before an event, last 10 days before an event, like, you can't really get any better by the work you put in. You get better because of the rest you're taking, right?
Yep.
That little bit you get from the taper, it doesn't come from any of the intensity you're doing within the taper. It comes from the recovery side of
Yep.
things, right? And that's the
Yep.
side you emphasize. And to your point as well, I think it is good to keep some intensity in there, but make sure that you're reducing the volume of that intensity,
Yeah.
right? So it's like, okay, if on a typical training week, let's say you're doing 3x20 steady state, right? FTP work. Maybe the week of the event, it's like, you're doing a 3x10, right? Or you're doing like 4x5, or just, something to like keep the continuity of the energy system you've been working within, but reducing that time and intensity by a significant amount, at least 50%, if not more.
Yeah. For sure. And I think I tell my athletes a lot, the goal of some of these taper workouts is you warm up and you do a couple efforts and you leave the bike feeling better than when you hopped on,
Yeah.
which is the exact opposite of training, where you get tired and then you
Yeah.
step off
Right.
the bike. Right. So
Yeah, you're
yeah,
completely blown. Right.
yeah,
No, that's great. It's like, feel better. Those are the sort of openers, or whatever anyone's term for it is, right? It's supposed to
mm-hmm.
make you feel better.
Yep.
If you're swinging back the other way towards fatigue, you went too far, right? And then it's like, just make sure the next couple days are easy, and recover, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. So show up as fresh as possible and get more sleep, take a few extra rest days, and just know that that is far better than trying to squeeze in a little extra.
Right.
That's for sure.
Yeah.
I'd say my third bullet point would be, because we talked about like the single track, we talked
Yeah.
about this steep hill climb at 60%. It wasn't that bad, but a lot of that stuff was properly technical, man. And so my third bullet point is, if there's a potential to have this technical terrain in there, make sure you do technical training, right?
Yeah, 100%. And like, I'll be the first one, I'll be the poster child for that. Cause I'm coming from a roadie background, for the most part, and transitioning into these gravel races and unroad races, whatever you want to call them. Like we said at the beginning, they're just getting gnarlier. And usually when we say like gnarlier, that involves more single track at some point, right?
Yeah.
It's the stuff that's harder to ride on a drop bar bike. And I think that's been, for me and for a lot of my athletes, an emphasis of what we're doing is go actually spend time on that stuff, right? Because if you ignore it, and it's easy to ignore because a lot of us aren't as confident on it, right? And especially not on our gravel bike, right? You're like, hey, like, I could rip that on my full suspension, no problem. But when we're out there on drop bars, in a big group of people, and we're on 40C tires or whatever it is, right? Like, I think the game changes, right? And so you need to go out and practice what you're going to be experiencing on race day. Absolutely.
Yeah. And this is an interesting one too, because this is, I feel like between, training talks at Leadville camps, different podcasts, writing articles, this is something I've been preaching for 15 plus years, be it the Breck epics, the Swiss epics, and this kind of thing. We get a lot of people that are super fit coming to these events, roadies, triathletes, mountain bikes alike, and you come in and it's funny because you'll have people climbing with you if pretty good shape, but then you never see them again until the next hill climb because you get dropped on the downhill. You see the crashes and all this kind of stuff, and to me it's like, man, that is like, work some of that technical skill, because it's really going to help you at least like decrease anxiety. But there's also a lot of like good safety aspects of it. And I keep on seeing, I saw it at BWR. I see it often, but I think to your point is, it's pretty easy to not do it when you're not good at it, because why would you do that when the majority of the days,
right?
It's not enjoyable. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And if you're good at hill climbing, you'll probably pick that because you can justify, I'm going to be hill climbing a lot more than downhilling.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think it's so critical, and I think about it this way. It's like, I know myself personally, like, I'm the guy that like loves to go out and climb and like do the climbing and the fitness part. Technical side, maybe not as much my forte. And there's probably a lot of other individuals in the same boat, and working with my athletes. It's like, think of it as allowing you to harness your well-earned fitness more, right? Because if you're getting dropped because you can't hold the wheel through a technical section, like, you're not really going to be able to take advantage of all the fitness that you have. At some point, you're going to burn all your matches chasing, right? And then, it kind of ends up, you end up not really finishing where you want to finish because you weren't able to take advantage of your fitness in the ways you wanted to, right? Because you ended up having to burn all that up. And I've been in that position before, right? And so I think it's really, you have to find a way to work it in, and there's always ways to work it in. It's like, okay, well, if you're going to go out on, a day and do intervals, right? And maybe that's on the road, like maybe there's an opportunity, on the back half of that ride to just go and ride some trail right after your interval work, right? Or find a way to work it in. It doesn't always have to be max speed either, right? Just get a feel for what it's like. Just spend time on it, right? You don't even have to necessarily go in with like this very dedicated skills practice focus. Just go spend time on it, right? And you'll learn and you'll adapt. You'll find a way to navigate those sectors better just by the exposure piece, right?
Yes. Yep. Yeah. And that's a great way to implement it, right? Very simple, very straightforward. Just go and do it and take the air of expectation down a bit. Just like get through it. Right. To level up a little bit from there is, ride with somebody who is a little bit more technically proficient, because if you're following wheel, then you can, it's like, he's taking that line, or, she's going a little bit to the right like that. I never thought about that. And so riding with somebody who's better than you, I mean, that's a great way to improve skills. And doing so in a non-race setting is very appropriate.
Right. Absolutely. I was following your wheel in the race, right? Like, I was like, we'd get some technical section, be like, all right, Adam's going to the front, so I feel good just sitting back here. I'll let him, pick the line, and it worked really well. I think like you've got that experience and had that background, and that's what you're looking for, in training and racing. Is like, go ride with people that are going to show you how this can be more efficient. Right. And that'll kind of trickle down to the way that you approach things too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, for the record, I love the technical bits in this race. I thought they were awesome. I was very fatigued at the end of it. And so when they kept on coming, I was like, "Whew, gosh," because it
Yeah.
still costs me more than like, cruising down some pavement. So I loved it. But I mean, it was a lot, and it even tested me. And I would say
Yeah.
I would rank myself pretty proficient in technical terrain. And
Yeah.
so for others that are not, it costs you more physiologically. And then the other bit that you talked about was, if you're not technically proficient, you won't be able to capitalize on all the fitness that training that you did. The other reason is because if you're moving in a group together, like you were like with the top women, and we were all
Mhm.
kind of together for a bit. Um,
Right.
if you hit a technical section and you can't keep up with everybody in that group, you drop by, and it's not even a fitness related thing at that point.
Hmm.
You get
Hmm.
separated from the group and you can't, this didn't happen to you, but then in a scenario like that, you can't reach that group anymore.
Right.
So that's where your race is kind of not as optimized in
Yeah.
that situation. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It's happened to me before, and I think to other athletes as well. And it's really disheartening because you're like, I felt so strong going into this, but now I'm in no man's land, right? And I'm burning all this energy and going nowhere, right? And so much of
Yeah.
these races are so long and so hard, and there's so many sections that it's hard to find speed and time on, right? If you can't spend time in the group and stay within those groups during these big, hard, gnarly off road races, you're going to be out there a lot longer. It's going to hurt a lot more, and morale is going to go way down. And I think, like, when you talk about some of these races and the ups and downs, it's like it's so key to keep that morale high. And sometimes all you need is that wheel to follow, right? So you don't work on your skills. I think there's a lot of ways that can hurt you,
Yeah.
from a lot of different directions.
Yep. Yeah. And my last thing that I'll say on that is, if you are someone who can identify with, I need to work on my skills, be willing to sacrifice, one day a week
Mm-hmm.
of non-fitness training, meaning, okay, my fitness is good, I'm a good hill climber, but I'm going to take this one day to ride some technical stuff, because that's the other feedback I get from some of my athletes is, I don't get the same TSS, I don't get the same volume, I don't get the same, like, all the things, right?
Mm-hmm.
that we normally track as
All the
endurance
things we're
nerds.
obsessed over, right? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it's a hard selling point to be like, okay, but if you do this, you will get something in the future that is more powerful than all those
Mhm.
metrics, right?
Right. Right.
So for our listeners here, is just know that you gotta work on stuff that you can't measure in order to get a better result that
Mm-hmm.
I would argue could be measured just by the sheer podium or the time or the real feel on the day. And that's
Yeah.
super important to me.
Yeah. 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Well, my last point is, and I feel like kind of a broken record sometimes, because we talked about race day fueling on this
Yeah.
podcast before, but this can be your greatest success on the day, regardless of how good that your technical training was, your hill climb
Mm-hmm.
training was, or anything like that. So, from a race day fueling standpoint, Madison, like, I don't know, how would you rank this on a scale of 1 to 10 in the way of importance?
Um, I'm gonna call it a 10 because I think, like, again, like, if we're talking, I use these, all sorts of terms all the time, but it's like accessing your fitness, or like harnessing your fitness that you
Yeah.
have. You have to build that, but in order to access it to its fullest extent, there are certain things that you absolutely must do, and fueling is that number one, right? Because if you don't get the hydration and nutrition dialed, it doesn't matter, really won't ultimately matter what your FTP is, because you won't be able to ride anywhere close to that at hour
Right.
6, right, or 7.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
and I think, like, it's paramount, right? I think it's a 10 out of 10.
Yep. Yeah, I completely agree. And, to that end is, let's just say your fitness is medium and your hydration is terrible. Well, you're going to ride
Yeah.
terrible, right? That's another kind
Right.
of way of saying it. And, uh, you know, there's no magical recipe there, and there's within the context of this podcast. In fact, go back and listen to our gravel nutrition podcast, because we go through some details on that. But in the context of this podcast, we won't get into the particulars, because the particulars are, you need to suss this out in training to get your fueling game plan dialed. It needs to come way before race day. But Maddison, I'm guessing you've seen it where athletes maybe like asking you like the night before or like a couple days before, what should I eat, coach? What should I eat on Saturday?
Yeah.
It's like,
right. God. Yeah. It's tough to have that conversation. And I think like at that point, like it's too little too late, right? Like you really, like you said, like you have to do it in training. And if you've got a plan that you've already been working on and maybe it's not perfect, like that's still your plan, right? Like don't throw the book out the window and try to change a bunch of things right before the race, or do something that you haven't been doing, right? Because I think that more often than not, that's going to open you up for GI problems, other issues, right, that might come up. But this is something that you do months in advance, right? And I think with my athletes and yours, I'm sure too, it's like it's a constant thing you're covering. It's like, what did you eat and drink today, right? Because we know that this carbohydrate intake, hydration piece to things as well, right? It's so critical for maintaining performance, right? And I think and this is the other thing, I think making sure that you sort of have the opportunities to do it in training, like build training sessions where like you don't even really need to worry about what the power is, like practice the fueling piece, right? Like, I've had athletes ask me, oh, this ride wasn't that hard. My power wasn't that high, so I didn't eat that much, right? Or I didn't eat as much as I normally would for a 4 or 5 hour ride. But I'd come back and argue, well, yeah, like the intensity wasn't that high, but this is an opportunity to train your gut to handle that, right? To treat it like a gut training session, right? Like the power doesn't have to be high for you to train that piece of things, right? So this is something you can do whenever, right? Regardless of what the session is, because if you don't train your gut just like you train your body to handle the effort, then it's gonna fight back on that, right? On race day.
Yeah, that's it. And I talked with Coop on a podcast lately, just how trainable the gut is, and you can train your gut at zone 2, you can train your gut at zone 4. It's hard at zone 5 and above, but train it all the time, and in base, keep fueling there. But I'd say back to those fatigue resistant workouts that we just talked about, a couple hours, normalized power of tempo, those are great sessions to put in, race day fuel and see how that's going to fit, because that's race day intensity, and you'll want to know, how your body responds to that. So
yeah, absolutely. No, and I think that's a great point, is like having those specific sessions where it's like, not only are you tailoring them from a specificity standpoint on the physical side or the physiological side, but also on the fueling side too, right? Because when you are on in that race situation and it's getting later and later, and you've had to go hard, or put those efforts in, your sort of ability to fuel is challenged in those moments, right? And if you're not challenged similarly in training, I don't think you're going to respond to that quite as well, right? Like if you don't have that same, the struggle, we all know the struggle is like, we're like going cross-eyed, but we got to get the gel down, right? Or like we're in the middle of an interval. That's one thing I do with my athletes, as I tell them, like I say, hey, like actually take the gel in the middle of the interval, right? Don't always wait until in between during the recovery periods, because you're not always going to have that luxury, in a race. It's like you got to stay on some sort of schedule. And if you go 20 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes that's too long, without taking anything in.
Yep. Yeah, it's a really good point too. And the schedule, I'd say start with whatever reminds you to do that. And I would hate to give this recommendation, but I do have some athletes that use like the beeper thing on their
Right.
Garmin. It drives me bonkers, man. And I could never do that. But whatever it takes to remind you, do it.
Mhm.
Get to a point where you don't have beeps and dings and dongs going off, but like,
Mhm.
but then stay on that schedule. And I think that is really important because late in the day, you're so depleted anyway. You're going to have to put it in unless you're getting some sort of feedback of, you want to barf or something like that. Obviously, don't be shoving down a gel in that situation. But
Right.
usually those problems arise because you're not putting in on a regular basis.
Mhm.
So you get habituated through training on what you need to do, and maximizing the total calories via carbohydrate per hour is the way to do that. But that all has to be sussed out in a training session for sure.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, final question, Maddison, on especially on like race day fueling, but is it, are we packs or are we bottles? Team pack or team bottle?
Yeah, this is such a hot topic. And it,
It's hot
it
right
comes
now.
up,
It's hot.
and I think whether you're, whatever, no matter what level you're at too, it's like all the pro guys are arguing about it too, and they're all like, like, I don't want to use a pack, or I'll use bottles for whatever reason or another. I've gone back and forth. And again, I think like my initial, like, like I said, I'm coming from this like roadie background, and my initial response to like using like a hydration pack was kind of to turn up my nose at it a little bit and be like, like, I don't need that. Like, I don't want some heavy thing on my back weighing me down. Like, I'm just going in the cages, right? But I've definitely come around, and I think I'm pretty firmly in team pack at this point, because I've seen both sides of like using it and not, and what it's allowed me to do and what it doesn't. And so yeah, I think I'm team pack. And I noticed you didn't have one in the race, and you were rolling just bottles. And I know you were refilling at some stations here and there. So yeah, you were kind of full. You were team bottles, or like, how did you go through that process of trying to figure out what you wanted to do?
Yeah, as team bottles, man. And spoiler alert to everybody, Maddison crossed the finish line before I did. So
it was pretty close too. It was pretty. I think it was maybe a couple minutes or something like that, right?
Yeah, it was pretty close. But I think this is actually, goes back into some like of the logistics and in the planning.
Right.
Overall, I was pretty planned. I had some feeds out there. Kristen was out there doing some feeds for like my. I had some athletes and friends and stuff like that, so we were really fortunate in that way. And she crushed it, by the way. She's like best
awesome
aid station support person in the world. And but like I was ripping through fluids more than I thought, and I wanted to keep that going. And when we were all together, I had to stop because I was pretty out, and I didn't know what was coming, because it was like halfway through or something, and we were rolling with that group of the lead ladies.
Right. Yeah.
And like I was feeling good, I was rolling. But to your point, is they kept on throwing curveballs left and right, and we had, I don't know, it was like 13 or 15 miles, and I was like, okay, that's doable on maybe a third of a bottle, and I had a couple gels, and they were SIS, so I was like, okay, total content, I could get through this. But I was like, man, if they throw more curveballs, that's going to be way longer, and I know if I stay on my hydration nutrition, I'm good for the long run. However, so I stopped on that fast downhill to get more water and more things like this. And the reason I communicate all this to everybody listening, hopefully still, is because I dropped from that fast group, and I could never bridge back up. Now, if I would have had a pack in that scenario, and we talked about having a pack, like picking it up at the like halfway point, and I would have had it at that point, I could have stayed in that group and probably had, a faster time, or probably a more enjoyable time, because at some point I was riding solo, unmotivated, and woe is me. I'm so tired right now.
I've been there for sure. Yeah. Yeah. It's tough.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it'll probably be something that we can talk about for podcasts to come.
Right.
But yeah, packs and bottles, you got to figure out what's going to make the most sense for everybody. And I think that we're at a point where, the way that they're making packs these days, and from a cooling standpoint, the accessibility standpoint,
Yeah.
you could probably do that and go longer without having to stop, which maybe you
Yeah.
should have done.
Right.
So
Yeah, and that was kind of my thought around it was like, I want options, right? Like
yeah,
I want to be deep in that ride. And if I have the group, like I don't want to have to leave it until the last possible second. And I think it's like it's hard to say what's gonna happen. I think in this case, like it really worked out for me because I stayed in the group as long as I could. We hit the sort of point where the group blew up. And from there I was pretty much out and I was stopping and taking bottles. But I got the free ride all the way up to that point,
yeah,
or I had the benefit of riding in the group up to that point. I also lost a bottle early on, right? And so
yeah.
that's another
Another
thing
good
that
point.
can happen is I saw bottles strewn all over the place, in the first half of this ride, right? And so it's like I had to pack on. I lost a bottle for a second. I was like, ah, dang, like I lost that. And then I was like, nope, I've got plenty, right? Like I can keep rolling for a long time still because I have this pack. So I think for me, and especially if you don't have someone helping you at aid stations, right? Like you don't have the aid, you don't have the support, right? We were in San Diego. My girlfriend Allie was there. She was giving me bottles. She helped out a ton. Like same thing. At that race, I didn't wear a pack, right?
Yep.
At this one, I did because I'm kind of out there solo and like I'm not sure what's going to happen. So I just want as many options and I want to be able to go as long as I can, right? And not have to lose the group, in that moment.
Yeah. Yeah. In this conversation, I mean, again, it's for anybody at any speed, at any finish time, because it plays into the overall logistics. And I'd say for this race too, the other thing I kind of, relearned or was reminded of is how technical it was. There was some times in there where I was like pumping through on the cross
Yeah,
bike. I'm like, man,
right.
I could really use a drink right now, but like
Yeah,
didn't have my pack, right? You could have
yeah,
throw it in real quick. And that's the other thing to plan on. The more technical it is, the pack is probably the better way to go. The more
for
road
sure.
centric something is, and if you have feeds, probably don't have to. So all
Yeah,
things to consider.
yeah, yeah. It's just it's just all part of that planning piece, right?
Yep.
And I think like
Yep.
also the training piece. It's like I was running it in training or I did training sessions with the pack, and that's something I've had
Yeah.
athletes do too. Is like actually go out and wear it and like experience what it's like to like take hydration from that. But I think it just that just folds into that bigger piece of like because these events are so dynamic, they're so crazy, anything can get thrown at you at any time. Like
Mm-hmm.
having that plan and checking off every single thing. Like if you're gonna roll bottles, like be confident in that decision and roll them, right? But practice that in training. Right? And same thing with the pack. Like if that's what you want to do, like that's that might be a great option, but you need to sort of plan for that, right? And like experience that in training and what are you going to bring in the back or what are you going to bring in the bottles, all these things. Like it's just the preparation piece, right? And because these events are so crazy, it's like it requires a lot of planning, right? And
Yep.
preparation.
Yep. Yep. Full stop, man. Full stop. And speaking of stop, we should probably stop this podcast, but
Yeah.
not
Right.
without a good summary here first, Madison. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd say to take this thing home, doing what we do as coaches. I mean, we get to see all the comments on Training Peaks. We get to see the power files. We get to have the conversations with athletes afterwards. And I mean, it does seem like these quote epic events are getting more and more epic, and it's drawing the crowds, right? It's a good challenge. Long days, hard climbs, more technical single track, and it's getting a little gnarly. But don't think that you can skimp on the hill climb training or that single track training because you need to focus and prepare yourself as best you can, right? And
Yeah.
I think we covered some of those aspects of how best to do that, whether it is, the physiology training or the technical training. But it comes down to doing the actual work of that. And I don't know, anything that you want to add to the summary aspect of what we talked about today?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think like because, like we said, because these events are only getting gnarlier, because they're throwing so many different things at you over the course of this race. It's like you need to sort of combat that by checking all those boxes in training, right? So it's looking at all the components that make the race that could affect your performance, right? Like the technical side, the tactical side, the nutrition side, the physical side. Like look at those main pillars that might affect the outcome of your race and check them all off in training, right? Every week, like all of them, right? Like there should
Yeah.
be, like you said, like one ride focused just on skills, right? Every week, have some aspect of what you're doing focused on every single one of those things, right? And when you get there, then you don't have to worry about it as much, right? You know, you've
Yeah.
done it, and you prepped for it, right? And you can just go out there and ride hard, right? And you've got the plan dialed.
Yeah. And, as we're talking about these kind of final summary points, I guess this is a summation of what we talked about in total, but little bit of a new thought is, you know, a lot of these gravel and ultra endurance stuff, you have to be sort of a jack of all trades out there,
Yeah.
with, not the best hill climber, but pretty darn good at hill climbing. Not the best technical sender of sorts, but
Mm-hmm.
not bad at it either. You have to be very dialed on nutrition, all these things, right? So in your training, if you're looking at all those components, as you said, just checking the boxes of all these different pillars, you really become, a generalist, but that is kind of optimizing yourself for more ultra endurance cycling events, in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's so key. It's like you can't have a one track mind. It comes to performing in these things. You
Yeah,
gotta kind of cover all your bases, right?
that's it.
Yeah.
That's it, man. Well, Madison, if our audience, if they want to connect more with you, where do they find you?
Yeah, yeah. So you can look me up on Instagram. It's MWA Russell, and you can also find me on our CTS coaches bio pages. Yep, check out my background there, and yeah, give me a shout.
Cool. Well, and my last question is, yeah, are you taking on any athletes right now that we need to be uh, aware of if an audience member reaches out to us and says, we want Madison?
Yeah, absolutely. I am currently taking athletes, and I'm
Cool.
motivated to bring some people on, regardless of what you're working for. Yeah, stoked to work with anyone and everyone. We do free consultations, so even if there's just kind of the interest or the question, like happy to talk with anybody answering a question. So yeah, I'm excited to keep working with everybody and maybe work with some people on getting ready for some of these crazy gravel events down the road. So.
That's it. Great.
Yeah.
Well, thanks, Madison. Thanks for the time, and thanks for going a little bit longer today than we had planned.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Adam, for having me on. Really appreciate it.